Part 1. Water in a dry year. The creek went down all summer, and everybody watched it go, and by the end of August there were 4 places along 2 miles of it where a man could stand in the middle with dry feet. That is where it started. Not with a quarrel and not with an insult. With mud. Sitomana had lived 34 winters, and she had seen 3 dry years, and she knew the shape of them. A dry year does not kill anybody by itself. What a dry year does is take every small disagreement that a camp carries around comfortably, the kind of thing that gets settled with a joke or a gift or by 2 women deciding not to speak for a month, and it dries the give out of them. In a wet year, a man whose horses have been watered second says nothing about it for 4 years. In a dry year, he says something about it on the 9th day. She had been saying that to her brother all summer, in different words, and he had not been listening, because he was 19. On the 2nd night of the moon, when the calves grow hair, she woke because there was noise at the wrong end of the camp. She lay in the dark with her eyes open and counted the voices, and then she got up and put her blanket around her without waiting to hear anything more, because a woman of 34 who has buried a husband and a mother learns to move before she knows why. By the time she got down to the water, there were 11 people standing in a half circle, and somebody had brought a torch of twisted grass that was already going out. Her brother was standing in the creek bed with his hands at his sides, and a man named White Fox was lying in the wet sand with his head turned to one side, and there was a stone the size of a loaf of bread lying 9 inches from his ear, and he was not breathing. And every person standing there had already worked out both of those things, which was why nobody was talking. Sitomana went down the bank. She did not go to her brother. She went to White Fox and knelt in the mud and put 2 fingers on his throat under the jaw and held them there for a slow count of 30, and then put the back of her hand against his mouth, and then sat back on her heels. Then she looked up at her brother and said one word, which was his name. Hokshila. He did not answer. Look at me. He looked at her. He was 19 years old, and he was very drunk, and there was a cut over his eyebrow that was going to be a great deal more impressive in the morning, and his face had nothing in it at all. Not horror, not triumph, nothing. He looked the way a man looks when he has been shaken awake and has not yet remembered what country he is in. "Whose stone?" said Sitomana. "What?" "The stone. Was it in your hand or was it on the ground?" Somebody behind her said, "Sitomana," and she said, without turning, "Be quiet," in a voice that ended it. "I do not know," said her brother. "Think." "I do not know." His voice went up and cracked in the middle. "He came at me and I had it. I think I had it. I do not know if I picked it up." And Sitomana knelt in the mud beside a dead man in the dark and thought, with a clarity she was ashamed of for years afterward, that is the worst possible answer, and he will give it to every person who asks, and every time he gives it, he will be closer to a rope. Here is what a killing was, among her people, and it must be understood plainly or nothing that follows will make sense, because the whole thing turns on it, and most people who tell this story get it wrong in the first sentence. It was not a crime. That is the piece that does not go into English. In English, a killing is an offense against the law, and the law is an abstract thing belonging to nobody, and it is punished by the removal of the killer from the world of living people, by a rope, or by a cell, which is a slower rope. The dead man's family gets nothing out of that except the satisfaction, if it is one, of watching a second family be destroyed. Among her people, a killing was a debt. A man had been taken out of the world. There was a hole where he had been, a lodge without a hunter, a wife without a husband, 2 children without a father, an old woman without a son to bring her wood. That hole was a real thing, and it was measurable, and it went on existing every single day afterward, whether anybody was hanged or not. So the law, and it was a law, with procedure and precedent, and men whose entire standing rested on knowing it correctly, the law said, the hole must be filled. By the family that made it. Restitution. Horses, robes, guns, kettles, whatever a family had. paid in the open, before witnesses, accepted publicly by the family of the dead. And with it, and much heavier than it, an obligation. The killer's family took on the feeding of the widow and her children. Not once, not for a season, for as long as it was needed, in some cases 20 years. And the killer himself, if he was young, could be required to hunt for that lodge, haul its wood, water its horses, be at its door before light. To become, in the most literal and inescapable way, a replacement for the thing he had destroyed. And when it was done and accepted, the two families were tied together and could not be untied. They were relatives. They ate at each other's fires. Their children married. There was no vengeance afterward, ever, because vengeance against your own relatives is not a thing that has a name. It was not soft. Sitomana heard white men call it soft later, and she never had the words in English to explain how badly they had misunderstood. A rope takes 20 minutes. This took the rest of your life. This meant a 19-year-old boy carrying firewood on his back to the door of the woman whose husband he had killed, in January, at 40 below, for years, with her children watching him do it. But at the end of it, there were still two families in that camp instead of one. That was the entire point. It was the point that could not be got across to a man with a badge and 20 years of service, and she tried, and she failed. They carried White Fox up out of the creek before it got light. His mother made the sound at about the time the sky went gray in the east. There is no describing that sound, and Sitomana did not try. She heard it from 400 yards off, standing outside her own lodge with her arms folded, and she did what everyone in that camp did, which was to stand still until it stopped. Then she went inside and sat down and began to think, because there was nobody else in her family who was going to do it. Her family was this: herself, 34, widow of a man named Runs-Through, dead of a lung sickness in the winter of 1881, who had left her a good reputation and 2 horses, one of which had also died. Her brother Hoxila, 19, who was now the reason for all of it. Her sister Blue Day, 28, married out to a man on the far side of the agency, with 4 children, a decent husband, 2 horses, and $11. Her mother's brother Standing Elk, 61, who was respected, whose word carried in council, who had 8 horses and was owed quiet favors by perhaps 9 households. And an assortment of cousins, most of whom had come through the last 4 years the way everyone had come through the last 4 years, which is to say, with about a third of what they had started with. That was the whole of it. Once, in her mother's time, a family like hers would have counted 40 adults and 200 horses, and would have settled a thing like this in 3 days, without anybody outside the camp ever knowing it had happened. Now she sat in a canvas-topped lodge on a reservation on a creek that had gone dry, and did arithmetic. Her uncle came in at mid-morning without asking, which was his right, and sat down and said nothing for a while. "How many?" she said finally. "They have not asked yet. They will ask." "How many will they ask?" Standing Elk turned his hands over. "White Fox was 31. He was a good hunter and a quiet man, and he had 2 children, and there is a 3rd coming in the winter." Sitomana closed her eyes. "That is not in it," said her uncle. "That does not raise the number, but it will be in the room." "How many?" 40 horses, said Standing Elk, or the worth of 40. They will ask 40. They might take 35, and if they took 30, they would be talked about for 10 years. She sat with that. 40 horses in 1884, in a camp where the herd had been cut in half twice, once by the army in 1876, and once by 2 bad winters and a sale that everyone had been assured was voluntary. 40 horses was not a fine. 40 horses was the entire visible wealth of 4 families. "And how long?" she said. "Until the first snow. That is the custom, and they will hold to it, because they are proud people, and they will not look greedy by rushing, and they will not look weak by waiting." Her uncle looked up at the smoke hole. 11 days, 15 if it is a late year.
Say the rest of it.
You know the rest of it.
Say it out loud, Uncle. He will have to hear it said out loud eventually, and I would rather hear it first from you.
Standing Elk said, "And the boy is given to that lodge. Wood, meat, water, horses, whatever the woman requires, for as long as she requires it. He will be at her door before light, and at her door after dark. She may speak to him however she likes, and he may not answer."
Yes.
"And if she says at the end of a year that it is not enough, then it is not enough, and it goes on."
Yes.
Her uncle got up. "There is one more thing, and you have not thought of it yet, because it has not been true long enough for anyone to think of it first." He stopped in the doorway. "Somebody has written it down. There is a man at this agency, in a blue coat, who is paid to write down what happens in this camp, and he has already written it down, and that paper goes on the wagon on Thursday." She went to her brother in the afternoon. They had put him in their uncle's lodge, not because anyone thought he would run, since there was nowhere on that reservation to run to, and off it was worse, but because a young man in that position has to be in somebody's lodge, the way a broken thing has to be set down somewhere. He had slept. That was the first thing she noticed, and it made her so angry that she had to stand outside the door for a moment and get it under control before she went in. He had slept and washed the mud off, and he was sitting up eating. She sat down across from him. "Tell me all of it," she said, "in order. Do not tell me how you felt." He told her. It took a long time, and it was mostly useless, and out of 40 minutes she got about 9 facts. There had been whiskey, 2 bottles, brought in by a man named Little Hawk, whose brother-in-law worked for a trader at the crossing, which was a route everybody knew about and nobody stopped. There had been 5 of them at the creek. There had been an argument that started about water. White Fox's family watering horses at the last good hole in the middle of the day, which stirred the mud, which meant nobody downstream had clean water until evening. It was an argument that had happened at least 4 times already that summer. All 4 times it had ended with somebody laughing. And then it had not ended with somebody laughing. "He put his hand on my chest," said Hakshila. "1 hand or 2? 1. Open or closed?" He thought about it. "Open." "Then he pushed you," said Sitomana. "He did not strike you. Do you understand the difference between those 2 things?" "He pushed me twice." "That is not better, that is worse." She kept her voice flat. "A man who wants to fight pushes once and then hits you. A man who pushes twice is telling you to go home. There were 4 men standing there watching him tell you, and you were 19 and drunk in front of 4 men. Her brother's face did something complicated. "He was going to hit me." "Perhaps. It does not matter now." She leaned in. "Was the stone in your hand when he pushed you the second time?" And he said again, "I do not know." Sitomana looked at her brother for a while. He was her mother's last child. She had carried him on her back at 15, all one summer, when their mother was ill. She had taught him to swim, badly, in a river that was now a slough. He was clever and quick and lazy and generous, and he had never in his life been made responsible for anything, because there had been nothing to be responsible for. He had come to manhood in the years when men his age were handed hoes and told to farm ground that had never grown anything but grass, and he had done what a great many of them did, which was to become extremely good at nothing in particular. "Do you understand what has happened?" she said. "Yes." "Say it." "I killed White Fox." "That is what happened. That is not what it is." She put her hand flat on the ground between them. "What it is this. Washday Wing is sitting in a lodge 400 paces from here, with 2 children and a 3rd coming, and there is nobody to hunt for her, and there will be nobody to hunt for her in January. That is your doing, and it is permanent. You cannot make him alive. There is no arrangement any person can make that puts him back. So what is left is the hole, and the hole is filled by the family that made it. Uncle says 40 horses. 40 horses, she said, and you. And she watched her brother, for the first time since the creek, actually understand something. I will not, he said. You will. I will not carry wood to that woman's door like a— Finish it, said Sitomana. Go on, say the word. Like a woman? Like a dog? Say it out loud so I can hear what my brother sounds like. He did not say it. There are 2 roads, she said. On the first one, we pay, and you serve that lodge for as long as she says. In 11 years you will be a man of 30 with a name in this camp and children of your own, and White Fox's son will call you uncle and mean it, and you will hate every day of the first 4 years, and then you will stop hating it. She stood up. On the second road, a man with a badge puts you in a wagon. You go to a courthouse in a town where nobody speaks to you. 12 men who have never seen this creek listen to a lawyer for 2 days, and then they hang you in a yard in front of people who have come to watch. And Wash Day Wing gets nothing. Not 1 horse, not 1 stick of wood. Her children get nothing. That is the whole difference between the 2 laws, and you had better learn it quickly because a man is coming to explain the second one to you. Her brother sat looking at the fire. Which do you want? Said Sitomana. The first, he said in a small voice. Then you will do exactly what I tell you for 11 days, said his sister. And the first thing is that you will stop saying, I do not know. She walked back through the camp in the last of the light. It was very quiet. People looked at her and then did not look at her, and she understood that she was now, until further notice, a woman whose family owed a debt, which is a specific social condition with rules attached, like being in mourning. She had watched 3 other families occupy it in her lifetime and had never expected to occupy it herself. At the edge of the camp she stopped and looked east. The agency was 11 miles that way. The office, the storehouse, the police quarters, the little frame church, the flagpole with nothing on it most days. The wagon went to the railhead on Thursdays, and there was a mail bag on it, and in that bag there would be a paper written by a Lakota man in a blue coat who had been trained to write down everything that happened in this camp in a straight line with a date at the top of it. Death by violence, September 2nd, 1884. Killer known. In custody of relatives. And somewhere east of that, in a building she had never seen and could not picture, somebody would read it. She stood there a while. Then she went home and lay down and did not sleep, and counted horses in the dark. 9 her family could put a hand on tonight, and 31 that did not exist. Part 2. The Count. The asking came on the 4th day, and it was done correctly, which was the only mercy in that entire week. 3 men came from the other family. They came in the middle of the morning, in full daylight, on foot, which was itself a statement, because men who come on horseback are men who can leave suddenly. They wore good clothes. They stopped about 30 paces from Standing Elk's lodge and stood there without speaking until they were seen and invited in, and the whole camp watched them do it, and there was no sound anywhere except a dog and somebody's baby. Sitomana was not in that lodge. Women were not in that lodge for that conversation. She sat outside her own, 40 yards away, with a hide in her lap and an awl in her hand, and did not put a single stitch in it for an hour and a half. When it was over, the 3 men walked back through the camp the way they had come. Standing Elk stood in his doorway and watched them go, and then looked across at her and lifted 2 fingers off his thigh, which meant, come. 40, he said, when she was inside, 40 exactly. 40 horses, or the worth of 40 in other goods at a rate to be agreed. And they will be honest about the rate, because Elk Nation speaks for that side, and he has never in his life shaved a count. Her uncle sat down heavily. And the boy to the lodge. And one thing more, which was said quietly and only once, which means it was the thing they came to say. What? That White Fox's brother has been talking. Sitomana shut her eyes. White Fox's brother was called Bear Ribs. He was 24. He had been a small boy in 1876 and had grown up on the wrong side of everything that came after. He had been talking, and she had known it within a day, because 2 different women had made a point of telling her, in the way women tell you a dangerous thing, by mentioning it sideways in the middle of a conversation about something else. Bear Ribs had said, on the second night, in front of 6 people, that he did not want horses. "So they came to warn us," she said. "They came to warn us," agreed Standing Elk. "That is what a good family does. They are saying, pay quickly, pay fully, and pay in the open where everyone can see it, because we can hold our young man for 11 days, and we cannot hold him for 20. And once a thing like that is done, there is no law anywhere that unmakes it." "Then the 11 days are not about the snow." "It was never about the snow," said her uncle. "The snow is only what we say." She began the count that afternoon, and it took her 3 days. This is the part of the story nobody tells, and it was, in Sitomana's own judgment for the rest of her life, the hardest thing she ever did. Harder than the winter of 1881. Harder than what came later. And there was nothing dramatic in it whatsoever. It consisted of walking from lodge to lodge in a dry camp in the heat, sitting down, drinking something, talking about nothing for 20 minutes, and then asking. There is a way to ask. She had watched her mother do it, and her mother's sister, and as a girl she had thought it was simply politeness. It was not politeness. It was an entire technology, worked out over a very long time by people who had to live within 400 yards of each other permanently. You do not ask directly. A direct question forces an immediate answer. And an immediate answer from a person who has nothing is a no, and a no, once it has been said out loud, cannot be walked back without shame on both sides. So you sit. You talk about the water and the beef issue, and whether the agent's new clerk is a fool. You ask after the man's mother. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, you say a thing like, "We are trying to see what can be found," and you leave a space in the conversation, and the man either steps into that space or he does not. If he does not, you go on talking about the beef issue for another 10 minutes, and then you leave, and nobody has been humiliated, and you can come back in 4 days without anything having been broken. She did that 11 times on the first day. By dark she had her uncle's 8 horses, all of them, including the roan mare he had been offered $30 for in June and had refused. He brought them in himself, without being asked, and said nothing about it then or ever. Her own 1 horse. Her sister's husband's 2, sent with a message that he was sorry it was not more, delivered by a boy, because the man could not make himself come and say it to her face. 5 from 3 cousins. 16. 16 was more than she had expected, and it was nothing like enough. And she sat that night and looked at the number and thought, this was the easy part. Everything from here is asking people who owe us nothing. On the second day she went to the households that were owed. This was the real work, and it was the first time in her life that being a woman was an outright advantage, because Sitomana carried in her head an account book that did not exist on paper, and that no man in that camp could have reproduced. She knew that 11 years before, her mother had nursed Gray Blanket's wife through a fever for 9 nights. She knew that in the hard spring of 1879, her husband had given a sack of flour to a family named Long Bull, and had told nobody, and that the Long Bull woman knew. She knew which 2 men her uncle had spoken for in council in 1877, when speaking for them had cost him something. She knew that 4 years ago she had sat up 3 nights with a woman who lost a child, and that she had never mentioned it to anybody since, and that this last fact was precisely what made it worth anything now. None of that was a debt in the way a white man means the word. Nobody would ever have said, "You owe us." To say it out loud would have destroyed it instantly, the way light destroys a photograph. But it was real, and it was carried almost entirely by women. On the second day, Sitomana spent all of it. Everything 3 generations of her family had accumulated by being decent to people. In 1 day, in 11 conversations, in the heat. She got 9 horses. She also got 2 things she had not expected. Gray Blanket's wife,
who was 70 and had no horses at all, put into her hands a beaded pipe bag, old and very fine, worth 2 horses at any honest rate, and would not discuss it. And a man named Two Crows, who had never had a good word for her family in his life, gave her a young gelding, and when she started to speak, he said, "My brother was killed at the Rosebud, and nobody paid anything, and there was nobody to pay. I have thought about that for 8 years. Take the horse." 25 at the end of the second day, 15 to go, and the account book was empty. On the third day she got 4 horses and 2 refusals, and it was the refusals she remembered for the rest of her life. The first was Hollowhorn, who had 6 horses and who explained his position for a long time with great courtesy and considerable embarrassment. His son-in-law's family, the winter coming, the agent's new rule about the plow teams. It went on for 20 minutes. Sitomana sat and listened to every word of it and made her face agreeable, and when he had finished, she thanked him warmly and asked after his mother and left. What she thought, walking away, was, he has 6 horses and he is going to keep 6 horses, and in 4 years, when his own family needs something, I will remember this morning, and I will help him anyway, because that is what the whole arrangement is, and if I break it, then there is nothing at all. The second refusal was worse, because it was honest. A man named Ironshell, 40-odd, 4 children, 3 horses, met her at his door and did not invite her in, and did not let her sit down, and did not talk about the weather. "I know why you have come," he said. "I have 3. If I give 1, I cannot haul wood in January. If I cannot haul wood in January, my youngest is sick by February. I am sorry about White Fox, and I am sorry about your brother, and if I had 5, I would give you 2. He looked at her steadily. "There is nothing to talk about, so I am not going to make you sit down and talk about it for an hour to be polite. Go on to the next one. You have a great many to do." And Sitomana walked away from that door with her face burning, not from shame, but because it was the only time in 3 days that anybody had treated her like a person with a task, instead of like a widow with a tragedy. She put him on a list in her head that she kept for 11 years and eventually did something about. On the evening of the 3rd day, she sat outside her lodge and did the arithmetic out loud, quietly, to her uncle. 29 horses, 2 more in goods, the pipe bag and the kettle and Blue Day's blanket, call it 3. 32. 32, said Standing Elk. 8 short, 7 days left. Her uncle was quiet for a while. There is nobody left to ask. There are 40 households in this camp. There is nobody left to ask who will say yes, he said. You have been to everyone who might. What is left is the ones who will not. And each one you go to and are refused by is a public thing. And after 4 of them, the other family begins to hear that we are scraping. And when a family is heard to be scraping, the talk changes. He turned his hands over. They begin to say that we cannot pay. And when it is decided that we cannot pay, then what Bare Ribs wants stops sounding unreasonable. Sitomana sat looking at the ground between her feet. "Then say it," she said. "Say what?" "You have been circling it since yesterday morning, uncle, and you are 61 years old, and I am tired. Say the name." Standing Elk looked out at the dark. "Walks Behind has 40 horses," he said. And there it was. Everybody in that camp knew how many horses Walks Behind had, in the way that everybody in a small place knows the one fact about the one person nobody discusses. 40. Possibly 44. He kept them in a coulee 3 miles north, with a pole corral he had built himself, alone, in a country where no man builds anything alone. And he wintered them better than anyone else on that stretch of the creek, because he moved them 4 times a year, and did not overgraze. And he had lost only 2 head in the winter of 1881, when other men lost half. He was 39 years old. He had no wife, and no children, and no brother. And nobody had eaten at his fire in 3 years.
This was the reason, and it was not complicated, and it was the kind of thing that happens in every human settlement that has ever existed. In the winter of 1881, a man named Little Wound had been found dead in the snow 8 miles from the agency, with his skull broken. There had been trouble between Little Wound and Walks Behind about a horse the previous autumn, an ordinary trouble, the kind that half the camp had with somebody. The agency police took Walks Behind. He was held at the guardhouse for 9 days and then taken to a jail in a town and held there for 7 months awaiting a court, and then brought before that court, where after 2 days of proceedings he was released, because a freighter came forward and said he had seen Little Wound alive, drunk, walking north out of the wrong end of a whiskey ranch on the night in question, 22 miles from where Walks Behind had provably been. He came home in September of 1882, and nothing was ever said to him. Nobody accused him. Nobody in that camp had ever, once, in 3 years, said to his face that they believed he had done it. There was no counsel, no shunning, no decision. There was simply the fact that a man had been taken away by police in a wagon in front of everybody, and had come back 7 months later, and that some part of every person who had watched that wagon leave had settled into a shape that could not be unsettled. People were polite to him. That was the worst of it. They greeted him on the road. They bought a horse from him now and then and paid a fair price. And no woman sent a child to his lodge with food, and no man sat down beside him at a gathering. And when he spoke in a group, the conversation resumed a half-second later than it should have, every time, for 3 years. He had, so far as anyone knew, never once complained about any of it. "He will not do it," said Sitomana. "Perhaps not. He has no reason to. We are nothing to him. My husband never spoke for him. You never spoke for him." She looked at her uncle. "Did you?" "No," said Standing Elk after a moment. "I did not." "Why not?" Her uncle was silent for a long time. "Because in the 3rd month I was not certain," he said. "And a man of my age who speaks and is wrong is a man whose word is worth less afterward, and I had other things to spend my word on that year, and I decided to wait until it was clear." He rubbed his face with both hands. "And then it became clear, and by then it was too late for speaking to be worth anything, because he was already home." "So we are going to walk out there," said Sitomana, "and ask a man for 8 horses, a man that this family did not speak for when speaking cost 8 words." "Yes." "And who goes?" "Not me," said Standing Elk. "If I go, it is the camp asking, and he will hear it as the camp, and the camp is exactly what he has every reason to refuse." He looked at her. "If a woman goes to a man's lodge alone in the middle of the day with a matter of business, it is a private thing between 2 households. It costs him nothing to say yes, and it costs him nothing to say no either, which is what makes it possible for him to say yes." Sitomana looked at the fire for a while. "There is another reason you want me to go," she said. "Say that one too." Her uncle did not answer immediately. "You are a widow of good name with no children," he said at last, "and he is a man with 40 horses and nobody at his fire. And I have not said one word to you about that, and I am not going to. But you are the one going, and you will be in that lodge alone, and I would rather you had thought about it before you got there than after." Sitomana sat very still. "Get out of my lodge, uncle," she said without heat. "Yes," said Standing Elk, and got up and did. She sat there until the fire went to coals, and then sat there longer. At about the middle of the night she got up and found her good moccasins, the ones with the quill work her mother had done, that she had not worn since the burial of her husband, and set them by the door. Then she lay down and slept 4 hours, which was more than she had slept in a week. Part 3. The Man Nobody Eats With. She walked out to the coulee in the morning, alone, and it took her most of 2 hours because she went the long way around the shoulder of the ridge instead of straight across the flat. She told herself it was because of the heat. It was not because of the heat. It was because the straightway went past the north end of the camp in full view of about 9 lodges, and a woman walking north out of camp in her good moccasins is a woman that people will have finished discussing before she gets back. She was aware of the smallness of that, and she did it anyway, and she thought about it the whole way. The coulee was a good place. That was the first thing she noticed, and it told her a great deal about the man before she ever saw him. It ran north and south, deep enough to break the wind from 3 directions, with a cut bank on the west side and a spring at the head of it that was still running in the first week of September, which no other water on that whole stretch was doing. There was grass. There was a pole corral, 40 feet across, well set, the posts sunk deep and the rails lashed rather than nailed, which meant they could be taken down and moved. And there were the horses. She stopped at the lip of the coulee and looked at them for a while, and what she felt was not envy. It was something closer to professional respect and considerably more uncomfortable. They were in good flesh. In the first week of September, in the 3rd dry year, in a country where every animal she had seen in a week had its ribs showing, this man's horses were carrying flesh. They were not fine horses. There was no showy stock in that band, no racers, nothing anybody would sing about. They were exactly what a man builds when he intends to still be alive in 10 years. Sound feet, deep chests, ordinary colors, nothing that would catch a thief's eye from a distance. She counted 41, and then a foal. 43, said a voice below and to her left. There are 2 in the willows. Sitomana did not jump, which she was proud of afterward. Walks Behind was sitting on his heels about 20 feet down the slope with a piece of rawhide across his knee and an awl in his hand, in the shade, exactly where a person coming over the rim would not look first. He had been watching her walk in for at least 15 minutes. "You went around the ridge," he said. "Yes." "Most people go around the ridge." He went back to the rawhide. "It is farther." "Yes," said Sitomana, "it is." He did not say anything else. He did not stand up, did not offer a greeting, did not ask her business. He sat on his heels in the shade and worked at a piece of rawhide with an awl and let the silence sit there. And Sitomana, standing on the rim of that coulee in the sun in her mother's moccasins, understood that she was being tested, and that the test had begun before she arrived, and that the correct answer was almost certainly to wait. So she waited. She stood there for what she later estimated at 4 or 5 minutes, and it was one of the longest stretches of her life, and she did not shift her weight, and she did not speak. Walks Behind put the awl down. "There is water at the lodge," he said. "Come out of the sun." His lodge was small, and it was extremely clean, and both of those things bothered her. It was a canvas lodge, not a hide one. Nearly everyone's was by then, and it was pitched with the door east in the old way, and everything in it had a place. Bridles hung on a rail off the ground where mice could not reach them. A rifle in a case. A stack of 4 folded robes. 2 cooking pots, both scoured. No clutter, no half-finished anything, nothing waiting to be dealt with later. It was the lodge of a person who had a very great deal of time, and no one to interrupt him. He gave her water in a tin cup, and a piece of dried meat, which was the proper thing and which she noted, and then he sat down across the fire pit from her and waited. "You know what has happened," said Sitomana. "The whole agency knows what has happened." "Then you know the number." 40, said Walks Behind. "And the boy to the lodge, until the woman says otherwise." He said it without any particular tone. "How many do you have?" 32, counting goods. "In how many days?" 3. He looked at her for the first time properly, a short, direct, evaluating look, the kind a man gives a horse he is thinking about, and then away. "That is fast," he said. 32 in 3 days out of that camp is very fast. Who gave the most?" "My uncle. 8, all of them."
Standing elk has 9. 8, said Sitomana. The old gray died in July. Ah, said Walks Behind. Then he gave everything. Yes. Who refused you? And Sitomana, who had prepared 4 different ways of approaching the request and had rehearsed all of them on the walk out, discovered that she was not going to use any of them, because this man was not going to be approached. He was going to ask questions in a flat voice until he had what he wanted, and the only thing she could do that had any chance at all was to answer them exactly. "Hollow horn," she said, for 20 minutes, very courteously, and iron shell in 9 words at the door, without letting me sit down. Something moved at the corner of the man's mouth. "Iron Shell is a good man," he said. "Yes," said Sitomana. "I thought so too, and it made me angry." And Walks Behind looked up at her again, and this time the look lasted a little longer. "How many do you want?" he said. 8. "You need 8. How many do you want?" Sitomana set the cup down. 12, she said. 8 to pay the count. 2 because a payment that is exactly the number asked looks scraped, and a payment that is over the number by 2 looks like a family that is still standing, and the difference between those 2 things is what Bear Ribs hears when people talk in the evening. And 2 more because there are 7 days left, and something else will go wrong, because something else always goes wrong, and I do not want to come out here twice. The silence in that lodge went on for a good while. 12 horses, said Walks Behind. Yes. That is more than a quarter of everything I own. You know that. I counted them from the rim, said Sitomana. Yes, I know exactly what I am asking. And what does your family give me for 12 horses? Nothing, she said. There is nothing. You have seen the count. Everything we have is going the other way, and it will be years before there is anything at all. And I am not going to sit in your lodge and tell you a story about repayment that we both know is not going to happen in your lifetime or mine. Walks Behind picked up a stick and turned it over in his fingers. Then why would I, he said. And this was the moment. She had known it was coming since the middle of the night. She had had 2 hours on the ridge to think about how to answer it, and every answer she had built had fallen apart, and what came out of her mouth in the end was the true one, which she had not intended to use. Because in 3 days of walking around that camp asking for things, said Sitomana, I have learned exactly one thing, and it is this. Everybody in it is keeping an account. Every single person. What was given, what was not given, who spoke, who stayed quiet. And they are all keeping it in their heads, and they will be keeping it for 30 years. She looked at him. And you are the only person on this creek who is outside all of that. You do not owe anybody anything, and nobody owes you anything, and nobody has eaten at your fire in 3 years. Which means you are the only man I can ask who is free to say yes for a reason of his own. Walks Behind stopped turning the stick. That is a hard thing to say to a man in his own lodge. Yes. Did you decide to say it on the way out here? No, said Sitomana. I decided to say 4 other things, and none of them were true, and I looked at your face and understood that you would know. He put the stick in the fire. I will give you 12 horses, said Walks Behind. Sitomana kept her hands still in her lap, which took some doing. On one condition, he said, and I am going to say it badly, and I want you to hear all of it before you answer, and then I want you to go home and not answer today. Say it. Marry me. The fire ticked. I am 39 years old, said Walks Behind, in the same flat voice he had used to say there are 2 in the willows. I have 43 horses, this lodge, a rifle, and a good coolie with water in a dry year. I have no wife, no children, no brother living, and no sister. There is nobody who will come and look for me if I do not come back from somewhere. And I have worked out that if I broke a leg out here in December, it would be 6 days before anybody noticed. And I know which 6 households would say afterward that they had been meaning to come by. He was looking at the fire and not at her. I was in a jail for 7 months, he said. They let me go because a freighter came in and said where Little Wound had been. Nobody in that camp ever said one word to me about it, before or after. And that is the whole trouble. If they had accused me, I could have answered it. You cannot answer a thing that has not been said. So I have been a polite stranger in the place I was born for 3 years, and I have got used to it, and getting used to it is the part I would like to stop. He put another stick on the fire. Now, here is the plain arithmetic of it, and you will see it in a minute anyway, so I would rather say it myself than have you find it. A man alone cannot get back into a camp. There is no act he can perform. If I give 12 horses to a grieving family as a gift, out of nothing, it looks like a man buying something, and everybody will say so, and I will be worse off than before. But a man who marries into a family becomes that family's relative, and a relative cannot be quietly not spoken to. Your uncle would have to eat at my fire. Your sister's children would have to call me something. That is not friendship, and I am not asking for friendship. It is a place to stand. Sitomana said, "So you are buying it?" "Yes," said Walks Behind. "That is exactly what I am doing, and I will not pretend otherwise, and you would not believe me if I did." She was surprised into something that was almost a laugh and killed it. "Now the rest," he said, "because there is a part of this that is worse than the arithmetic, and you have already thought of it. Say it anyway. You are a widow of good name in a family that is about to be poor," he said. "I am a man with horses that this camp needs today. That is the oldest and ugliest bargain there is, and there is no version of it where I come out of it looking like anything but a man who waited until a woman had no other door." He finally looked up at her. "I know that. I want you to know that I know it. I am doing it anyway, because it is the only door I have got either, and I have been waiting 3 years, and no better one has come." The fire burned. "What do you want from a wife?" said Sitomana. It was, she thought afterward, the single most practical question she ever asked anybody, and it was the one that decided the whole rest of her life. "Somebody in the lodge," said Walks Behind, "somebody who knows where I have gone. Work done properly by 2 people instead of badly by 1. A name that is connected to other names." He shrugged very slightly. "If you are asking me the other thing, no, not unless you want it, and not for a long while, and if never, then never, and I will not raise it again after today. I am not a man who has to be managed. You will hear that I am not." "And if I say no?" "Then you say no," he said, "and I will give you 4 horses anyway, because 4 does not look like buying anything, and 4 is what I can do without a reason. It will not be enough, but it will be 4, and I would rather you had them." And that last sentence, offered flatly, with no weight put on it at all, was the thing that undid her, and she had to sit for a moment before she could speak. "You should not have told me that," she said. "You have just made your own condition weaker." "Yes," said Walks Behind. "I thought about that on the way to saying it." "And you said it anyway." "I have had 3 years to think about what kind of man I am willing to be for the sake of getting what I want," he said. "I have got as far as this and no further. Go home, Sitomana. Come back in 2 days." She went the straight way back. She made that decision at the top of the coulee, and she was aware of exactly what she was doing when she made it. And she walked past the north end of the camp in full view of 9 lodges in the middle of the afternoon, and did not hurry. Her uncle came to her lodge that night, and she told him. He took it in silence, which she had expected, and then he said the thing she had not expected, which was, "Do not do it." She looked up. "I sent you out there knowing it might come," said Standing Elk. "I told you so, and I have been ashamed of it since the moment you left. And I have sat here all day and worked out that I would rather be a poor family than be the kind of family that pays a woman out to save a boy who broke a man's head over muddy water." His voice was not steady. "You have already carried your mother's death and your husband's death and this whole count for 3 days on your own legs. I am not going to let you carry this too. We will go to the other family and ask for terms. It will shame us. I would rather be shamed." Sitomana sat and looked at her uncle for a long time. "Uncle," she said, "what do you think a woman's life is?" He did not answer. "My mother married a man she had spoken to 4 times," she said. "Her mother married a man she had never seen. I married Runs-Through because our families arranged it, and I was 17, and he turned out to be kind, and I was lucky, and everybody knew I was lucky, which tells you what the ordinary case was." She fed the fire. "You are talking as though there is some other life sitting over there in the corner that I am giving up. There is not. There is this camp, and there are 7 days, and there is a woman with 2 children and 1 coming who will have nobody to hunt for her in January." "That is not a reason to—" "I am not finished," said Sitomana. "I have thought about it the whole way home, and I am going to tell you the true reason, because you are the only person I will ever say it to." She put the stick down. "I sat in that man's lodge for an hour," she said, "and he asked me 11 questions, and every one of them was a question about the actual situation. Not one word about how I must be feeling. Not one word of comfort. He asked me how many, and in how many days, and who refused me. He heard 32 in 3 days, and he understood immediately what it had cost, which nobody in this camp has understood, including you." Her voice was perfectly level. "And then he told me the worst thing about his own offer before I could find it myself, and then he weakened his own position by telling me he would give 4 horses either way. He did that with nothing to gain. I have known men for 20 years who would not have done that." Standing Elk sat looking at the fire. "I am not telling you that I want to marry him," said Sitomana. "I am telling you that in 3 days of asking this whole camp for help, he is the only person who has treated me like a woman doing a difficult piece of work, instead of like a widow who has had a misfortune. And I am 34, and I am going to be somebody's relative for the next 30 years no matter what I do. And if I am going to be tied to a man, I would rather it were one who counts accurately." Her uncle rubbed his face with both hands. "And is that enough?" he said. "No," said Sitomana, "but it is a great deal more than most women in this camp were given, and I am the one who has to live in it, and I have decided." She went back on the 2nd day, in the morning, the straight way. Walks Behind was at the corral. He straightened up when he saw her and stood there with the gate rope in his hand, and did not come to meet her, and she came all the way across the flat to him. "Yes," said Sitomana, "with 3 conditions." "Say them." "The horses go to White Fox's family in my uncle's name and in the name of my brother, not in yours. Nobody in that camp is to hear that you paid for this, because the day they hear it is the day my brother's payment becomes your purchase, and he will never be a man here again." "Agreed," said Walks Behind immediately, and she understood that he had already thought of it and had been waiting to see whether she would. "Second, it is not until after. Not one word said in public until the giving is done and accepted. This camp is going to talk about it either way, and I will not have them talking about it during." "Agreed." "Third," she stopped, "I will keep my own lodge for the 1st year. I will be at your fire, and I will do the work, and you will not be alone, and nobody will be able to say we are not married. But I will keep my own lodge, and if at the end of the year I am still keeping it, then that is the arrangement, and you will not ask me about it again." Walks Behind looked at the horses for a while. "Agreed," he said. "You did not argue?" "No." "Why not?" "Because a person who is not free to leave a lodge is not in it," said Walks Behind. "They are only standing in it." He coiled the rope. "Which 12 do you want? Come and look. Do not take the roan with the white foot. He is the best-looking animal I own, and he has a soft foot, and he will be lame by spring, and Elk Nation will know it, and it will be the only thing anybody remembers about the payment." And Sitomana walked into the corral beside him, and the 2 of them spent the next 2 hours choosing 12 horses that would stand up to being looked at closely by a man who had never in his life shaved a count. It was, although neither of them said so, and neither of them noticed at the time, the first thing they ever did together. Part 4. 11 Days. The horses came into the camp on the 5th day, in the evening, driven by Sitomana and her brother and a cousin, and the camp watched them come. That was the piece Walks Behind had understood without being told, and it was why he had refused to come along and had ridden out at first light to the north instead. 12 horses arriving at dusk in the hands of the family that owed them is a family paying its debt. 12 horses arriving in the hands of a man with no relatives is a transaction, and it would have been in every lodge on that creek by breakfast. So he stayed in his coulee, and Sitomana brought them in, and by full dark the count in her uncle's holding pen stood at 44 head with 3 days still to run, and she went and sat down behind her lodge where nobody could see her and shook for about 10 minutes. Then she got up and went to work, because the horses were the simple half. The other half was her brother. He had been in Standing Elk's lodge for 5 days, doing nothing, being fed, sleeping too much. Nobody had asked anything of him. That is what a family does with a young man in that position. They keep him quiet and out of sight while the adults arrange things. And Sitomana had let it happen because she had been busy, and on the 5th night she looked at him properly for the first time since the creek and understood that they had made a serious mistake. He had had 5 days to build a version of it. He did not say so directly. Young men never do. What he did was ask questions with the answers already loaded into them. Whether anybody had asked what White Fox had said first. Whether it was known that White Fox had been drinking too. Whether Little Hawk had told anyone about the shove. "Stop," said Sitomana. "I only want to know if anybody. I know what you want to know, and I know what you are building, and you are going to stop building it tonight." She sat down. "Because if you carry that into the giving, they will see it on your face in 1 second, and the whole thing will fall apart in front of 40 people. I'm not building anything. You are 19, and you are frightened, and you are doing exactly what I would do," said his sister. "You are looking for the version where you are unlucky instead of the version where you are guilty. And there is a version like that. There is always a version like that, and parts of it are even true. He had been drinking. He did shove you. It was a stupid quarrel over mud, and any one of 9 men in this camp might have been standing where you were standing." Her brother's face opened up with relief, and she watched it open, and then she closed it. "And none of it matters," she said. "Not one word of it, because he is dead, and you are not. And the difference between the two of you is not that you were right. It is that you were quicker with a stone." He looked away. "Here is what is going to happen," said Sitomana. "In 3 days you are going to stand up in the open, in front of both families and half this camp, and you are going to say what you did. Not what he did. Not what the whiskey did. What you did. And you are going to say it in 9 or 10 words, and then you are going to stop talking. And whatever anybody says to you after that, you will not answer." "What if Bear Ribs?" "Especially him." "He will say things about me in front of everyone." "Yes," said Sitomana. "He will say the worst things anybody has ever said to you, in public, and he will be entitled to say them, and you will stand there and take it with your hands at your sides. And every single person watching will be counting, and what they will be counting is whether you answer. If you answer once, 1 word, 1 look, then you are a young man who is sorry for himself, and the talk turns, and Bear Ribs starts to be the one people feel for." She leaned forward. "You cannot win that morning. Do you understand? There is no outcome where you come out of it well. The only thing you can do is not lose it, and the way you do not lose it is to stand still." Her brother was quiet for a while. "I keep seeing it," he said in a different voice. "Yes?" "His hand." When he went down, his hand, it went out like he was catching himself, and then it stopped. He was looking at nothing. "I did not know a person stopped like that. I thought there was more." "No," said Sitomana, "there is not more." He put his hands over his face, and she sat with her brother while he came apart for the first time in 5 days, and did not touch him, and did not tell him it would be all right, because it was not going to be all right, and one of the few useful things she knew was that a person who is told a lie in that state remembers being told it for the rest of their life. On the 6th day, 3 things happened, in this order. The first was that Sitomana went to see the widow and was refused. This was correct and expected, and it still went through her like cold water. She walked to the lodge in the morning with a bundle of good meat and a new kettle, and she did not go to the door. You do not go to that door, but stopped at a proper distance and waited to be noticed, and after a time White Fox's mother came out. The old woman looked at the bundle and then at her. "Not yet," she said. "I understand. When it is accepted, you may bring things. Until it is accepted, you bring nothing, because a thing brought before is a thing that asks." She was not unkind about it. "Do you have the count?" 44. The old woman's face did not change, but something in her shoulders moved. "That is over," she said. "Yes." "You did that in 5 days." "Yes." White Fox's mother looked at her for a moment longer, and then said quietly, in a voice that was not meant to be quoted anywhere, "My son liked your brother, before. He said he was quick, and he was going to be somebody if anybody ever gave him a thing to do." And then she went inside, because there is a limit to what can be said before the day. Sitomana stood there with the meat and the kettle for a while, and then took them home. The second thing was bear ribs. He came at midday into her part of the camp which he had no business doing, and stood in the open between the lodges, where everyone could see and hear him, which was the entire object. He was 24. He was not drunk. That was the frightening part. 44 horses, he said. Sitomana was outside working, and she went on working. "Everybody is talking about it," said Bear Ribs. 44 in 5 days. They are saying what a strong family, what a good woman. Look how quickly it was done." He came a few steps closer. "Nobody is saying my brother's name. 5 days, and I have not heard one person in this camp say his name out loud. They say the count. They say the giving. They say how many did she get today." And Sitomana put down the awl because he was right, and because a person who is right must be answered. "White Fox," she said. Bear Ribs stopped. "White Fox," she said again. He watered his horses at the deep hole because it was the only place with 2 feet of water in it, and everybody downstream complained about the mud, and he had a right to it, and he knew he had a right to it, and that is why he pushed my brother instead of hitting him. He was 31 years old. He is going to have a child in December who will never see him. His name is White Fox, and I will say it as many times as you want me to say it." The young man stood in the middle of the camp with his mouth open. "You are right that nobody says it," said Sitomana. "They do not say it because they are counting horses, and the counting is the only thing anybody knows how to do, and it is easier to count than to sit with your mother." She picked the awl back up. "You are right, and you should say so, and you should say it to your own people and to me, and not out here in the middle of the path where 9 lodges can hear you, because out here it is not grief. Out here it is you telling this camp that you are still deciding." Bear Ribs' face went very hard. "Maybe I am still deciding." "I know you are," said Sitomana. "Everybody knows you are. That is why 3 men walked to my uncle's lodge on foot to warn us, and it is why your mother has not slept, and it is why your brother's widow has had to think about you every single day of the worst week of her life, on top of everything else, because now she has to worry about what you are going to do." She looked up at him. "You are 24, and you are the only man left in that lodge, and you are making the whole thing about which way you are going to jump. That is the part I would think about, if I were you, standing out here in the path." He stood there for a long moment. Then he walked away and did not answer, and Sitomana sat with her hands shaking over her work and thought, "That was either the best thing I have ever done, or I have just killed my brother." The third thing happened at dusk, and it was a boy on a horse from the agency, riding through the camp calling for standing elk. The news was 4 sentences long, and it emptied the camp. A United States Deputy Marshal had come in on the Thursday wagon. He had spent 1 day at the agency office reading the police book. He had asked for a map of the creek camps and for the name of the man who wrote the entry for the 2nd of September, and for 2 agency policemen to be made available to him. And he had said, in front of the clerk and the interpreter, that he would ride out on Monday morning to take a prisoner. Sitomana stood in the doorway of her lodge and listened to it and did the arithmetic without meaning to. The giving was set for Monday. "How far is it?" she said. 11 miles, said her uncle. "Then he leaves at first light, and he is here by 9. Or he leaves at 8, and he is here by 11. There is no way to know." And Sitomana looked at her uncle across the fire and said the thing that had been sitting under everything for 9 days. "Then we move it. Sunday. Tomorrow." Standing Elk shook his head slowly. "We cannot." "Uncle, listen to me," he said. "The day was agreed between 2 families. If we go to them tonight and say, 'Let us do it a day early because a white man is coming,' then the whole thing changes in their hands. It stops being a payment and becomes an escape. Elk Nation is an honest man, and even he will hear it that way. And Bear Ribs," he turned his hands over, "Bear Ribs will hear it as us hiding the boy behind a ceremony. And he will be right, a little, which is what makes it dangerous. Then he takes him before it is done. Perhaps. Uncle, if that man rides in here at 9 o'clock on Monday morning and the horses have not been accepted, then everything, 5 days of walking, everything I have." She stopped and got hold of herself. "Then Washday Wing gets nothing, not 1 horse, because the moment he is arrested there is no debt to settle. There is only a man in a wagon and a family with a hole in it and 44 horses standing in a pen with nowhere to go." "Yes," said Standing Elk. "Then what do we do?" Her uncle looked into the fire for a long time. "We do it at first light," he said, "on Monday. As agreed, the same day, not a different day, so that nothing is broken. But at first light instead of the middle of the morning, and I will go tonight and tell them plainly why, and I will not pretend it is anything other than what it is. Elk Nation has a grandson in the police. He will understand better than we do." "And if the marshal comes at 7? "Then he comes at 7, said Standing Elk, "and he stands there and watches, and we go on with it in front of him, and whatever he does he will have to do in the open with the whole camp looking at him." He got up. "There is one other thing," he said, "and you will not like it." "Say it." "Somebody must ride out tonight and meet that man on the road tomorrow and slow him down. Not stop him, slow him. Talk to him, take him the long way, be helpful, be a nuisance, and be somebody the boy is not related to, so that if it goes badly it does not fall on this family." Her uncle looked at her. "There is exactly 1 man on this creek with no relatives, who has spent 7 months in a white jail and 2 days in a white court, and who therefore knows more about how those men think than anybody within 40 miles. Sitomana stood very still. "You said no word was to be spoken until after," she said. "I am not asking you to speak a word," said Standing Elk. "I am asking you to go out there at night and ask a man to put himself in front of a United States Marshal for a family that did not speak for him when he was in a jail." She walked out to the coulee for the 3rd time in 5 days, in the dark, and she did not go around the ridge. He was awake. There was a small fire, and he was sitting at it with the rawhide again, and when he heard her coming he did not reach for the rifle, which she noticed. She told him in about 40 words. Walks Behind listened all the way through, and then sat looking at the fire for a while. "What is his name?" he said. "The marshal." "Keen." The interpreter said it twice. "Old man or young?" 50, they said, gray, 20 years in it. "That is worse," said Walks Behind, "and it is also better." He put the rawhide down. "A young one wants to make a name and will do a stupid thing to get it. An old one has seen everything twice and cannot be frightened and cannot be flattered, and there is only one way to move a man like that." "What way?" "You cannot move him," said Walks Behind. "You can only give him a reason that fits inside his own rules. They will not do a thing because it is right. They will do it because it is regular." He stood up and began, without any further discussion, to saddle a horse in the dark. "Go home and sleep. You are getting married in about 30 hours, and you have not slept in 9 days. "You are going now?" "He will start early."
Men like that always start early. I want to be on that road before he is. He tightened the cinch. Sitomana. What? When he asks you what your people do about a killing, and he will ask, because they always ask, and then they always explain to you why it is wrong, do not tell him it is our custom. Why not? Because custom is a word they have for the things they are going to take away later, said Walks Behind. Tell him it is the law. Say the word law. Say it the way he says it. He led the horse out past her into the dark. He will not agree with you, but he will hear it, and it will sit in him, and men like that cannot leave a thing alone once it is sitting in them. Part 5. The Rider with the Paper. Deputy Marshal Thomas Keene was 52 years old, and he had been carrying other men's warrants for 21 years, and he had come out of County Clare at the age of 9 in a ship where 2 of his sisters had died in the same week, and he had never once in his adult life told anybody that. He left the agency at 5:30 in the morning with 2 Indian policemen, and he found a man sitting on a horse at the ford of the creek 4 miles out, waiting for him in the gray light. Keene pulled up. "Good morning," said the man in careful, slow, unmistakably jail-learned English. "Morning." Keene looked at him for a moment. "You're waiting on me." "Yes." "Been here long?" "Since about 3, said Walks Behind. Keene put both hands on the horn of his saddle. In 21 years he had been ambushed twice, lied to more times than he could count, and met perhaps 4 men who told him a straight and disadvantageous fact in the first sentence. He looked at the man on the horse, no rifle in sight, both hands where they could be seen, sitting square in the middle of the road at a ford, which is a place where a man is at every possible disadvantage. "All right," said Keene. "Say it." "The crossing above is bad since the dry," said Walks Behind. "There is a cut in the bank you cannot see from the road, and it has thrown 2 horses this summer. If you go by the north side, it is longer by an hour, and there is water for the horses at the head of it." "And you rode out at 3 in the morning to tell me about a bank." "No," said Walks Behind, and Keene, in spite of himself, laughed, one short, unwilling breath of it. "Well," he said, "we'll go the long way then, and you can tell me the rest of it as we ride, since that's what you came for." They rode for an hour and a half. The 2 agency policemen rode 50 yards back and said nothing at all, which Keene noted and understood perfectly. They were Lakota. They lived in that camp. They had families in it. They were paid $10 a month by the United States government to be exactly nowhere on a morning like this one. "Tell me about the boy," said Keene. 19. There was whiskey. There was an argument about water at the last hole in the creek, which has been an argument all summer. He killed a man named White Fox with a stone, and he does not remember whether he picked the stone up or whether it was already in his hand. And that is the truth, and it is the worst answer he could give, and he gives it every time. Keene rode away in silence. "You're not from that family?" "No." "Then why are you doing this?" "His sister asked me," said Walks Behind. "And that's the whole of it?" "That is the whole of it today," said Walks Behind. "It is not the whole of it." Keene glanced at him. He had by then worked out several things about the man riding beside him. That his English had been learned somewhere with walls, from other men in a hurry. That he was not afraid, which was rare. And that he had a way of leaving a small silence after a question that Keene had only ever encountered in one other category of person, which was men who have been questioned professionally. "Where were you held?" he said. Walks Behind did not pretend not to understand. 9 days at the agency guardhouse, 7 months in the jail at the county seat, 2 days in the court. On what? A man was found in the snow with his head broken. There had been trouble between us about a horse. And? A freighter came and said he had seen the man alive and drunk 22 miles from where I was, at the hour it happened. He looked straight ahead. They let me go in the afternoon. Nobody said anything to me. A clerk gave me back a knife and 11 cents. Keene rode for a while. "Did you get anything for it?" he said. "The 7 months?" "No."
"No, you wouldn't have," said Keene. "There's no provision." That is what the lawyer said. And Keene, who had put a great many men into that same machine and had watched it work correctly and incorrectly for 2 decades, found that he did not have anything to add to that, and they rode on. After a time, Walks Behind said, "What will happen to him? That depends on a jury. Say the likely thing." Keene considered whether to give the professional answer or the true one, and gave the true one, mostly because of the 11 cents. He'll be taken in to the county seat. He'll be in that jail 4 to 7 months waiting on a term of court, same as you were. He'll have a lawyer for about 20 minutes before it starts, and the lawyer will be a young fellow doing it for the practice, or an old one doing it for the $8. There'll be no interpreter unless somebody makes a fuss about it, and mostly nobody does. He said it flatly. 12 white men on the jury, ranchers and townsmen. They'll hear that an Indian killed a man with a rock in a drunken fight, and about a third of them have got a stock complaint against your people already, and a quarter of them lost somebody in '76. And then? And then they'll likely find him guilty of murder in the 2nd degree, and he'll get 10 to 20 in the territorial penitentiary, said Keene. Or 1st degree, if the prosecutor's ambitious and makes something out of the stone being picked up. Then he hangs. How long is 20 years in that place? For a man off this country? Keene looked out at the horizon. 4, 5. They get the consumption in the 2nd winter, mostly. I've taken 11 men in, and I know of 2 that came out. Walks Behind nodded slowly. And the woman? He said. What woman? White Fox's wife. She is 27. There are 2 children and a third coming in December. Keene frowned. What about her? What does she get? She doesn't get anything, said Keene. That's not what a criminal court is for. That's, if there's damages to be had, that's a civil matter. And she'd have to bring a suit, and she can't bring a suit because she's not a citizen and she hasn't got $2, and there isn't a lawyer within 140 miles that would file it. He heard himself as he said it. It's the state that's wronged, do you see? Not the family. The state prosecutes. Yes, said Walks Behind. That is what I wanted to be sure of. And he did not say anything else for 2 miles, and Keene found that the silence had a shape to it that he did not like. Say it, said Keene at last. You've been carrying it since the ford. This morning, at first light, said Walks Behind, in the camp you are riding to, 44 horses will be given by the boy's family to the dead man's family, in the open, in front of everyone, and the boy will be given to the widow's lodge to hunt for her and haul her wood and water her horses for as long as she requires it, which may be 20 years. And if it is accepted, the 2 families are relatives after that, and there is no more of it, ever, and her children will not go hungry this winter. Keene's jaw set. Blood money, he said. That is one way to say it. It's the way it is, man. And Keene was suddenly and genuinely angry in a way that surprised him. A man's dead, and his people take payment for it in livestock. Do you know what that says? It says a life has a price on it, and the price is 44 horses, and if you've got 44 horses, you can kill whoever you like. How many families on this creek have 44 horses? Said Walks Behind. That's not none, said Walks Behind. Not one. That count was made by 11 households and 3 days of a woman walking from door to door, and everything one old man owns, and it is not finished when the horses are handed over. That is the small part. The large part is that a boy of 19 stands at a woman's door before light every morning for years, and every person in that camp watches him do it, and he cannot stop, because if he stops, his sister and his uncle and his sister's children carry it. Keene opened his mouth. You hang him, said Walks Behind, and it costs his family nothing but grief. There is no work in it. Nobody carries wood. My way, the whole family pays every day for 20 years, and the dead man's children eat. Which of those 2 is the cheap one? They rode 100 yards. That's a clever argument, said Keene. "It is not an argument," said Walks Behind. "It is the law." "It's your custom." "It is our law," said Walks Behind. "It has rules. There is a proper number and an improper one, and men who are known for judging it, and a form of words, and witnesses, and it can be refused, and there is a thing that happens if it is refused. It is written down nowhere, and every person on this creek could recite it to you." He turned his head. "Your law is written down, and I have watched 2 days of it in a courtroom, and I could not recite one line. That does not make it not a law. It only means it is not mine." Keene rode in silence for some time. "I'll tell you what I think," he said finally, "and then we'll leave it, because we're near." "Say it." "I think one law for every man is the only decent thing anybody ever invented," said Keene. "I came off a boat at 9 years old into a country where there were signs in the windows about people like me. And I've spent 21 years serving paper on white men who thought their name or their money put them outside of it. And every time I put one of them in a wagon, I felt something you'd not believe." His hands were tight on the reins. One law, same for the rich man and the poor man and the Irishman and the Indian. Now you're telling me that out here it should be different, that these people over this line get their own arrangement. And I'm telling you that the minute you say that, you've said they're not the same as everybody else. And there's not one instance in the history of the world where that ended well for the ones on the far side of the line. Walks Behind thought about it for a long way. "That is a good argument," he said. "It is better than I expected. Thank you. It is also not true here, and I will tell you why, and then we will leave it as you said." He nodded ahead at the smoke of the camp. "One law for every man means every man is in it. Can that boy vote?" Keene said nothing. "Can he sit on the jury that will try him? Can he bring a case against the trader who sold the whiskey? Can that woman sue anybody for her husband? Can any person in this camp be sworn in as a witness in some counties of this territory?" He let it sit. "No. So it is not one law for every man. It is one law that reaches into us and takes, and does not reach the other way and give. You are not offering him your law. You are offering him the punishing half of it and keeping the rest." Keene rode with his jaw locked. "And I will tell you the last thing, and then I am finished," said Walks Behind. "I know the case. Crow Dog. 2 winters ago. A Brûlé man killed Spotted Tail on this same agency, and the family settled it in the old way. $600 and 8 horses and 1 blanket. And the courts hanged him anyway. And then the highest court in your country in Washington said no. Said the United States had no power to try one Indian for killing another Indian on his own land, and let him out of the cell and sent him home." He looked at Keene. "December, the year before last. Ex parte Crow Dog. A lawyer said the name to me 4 times in a corridor because he thought it was funny that I wanted to know it." Keene did not answer. "So I will ask you a plain question," said Walks Behind. "What is written on the paper in your coat?" Here is the truth of it, which Keene had known since Thursday and had ridden out with anyway. He did not have a warrant. He had a letter from a United States Attorney's office instructing him to proceed to the agency, ascertain the facts of a killing reported in the police book, and take the offender into custody pending determination of jurisdiction, which is a sentence written by a man in an office who knew perfectly well what Crow Dog had said, and was hoping that a deputy 11 miles up a creek would resolve the difficulty by simply having the man in a cell already when the question came up. And Congress was going to fix it. Everybody in the service knew it. There was a bill, 7 crimes, murder among them, brought under federal courts on the reservations, drafted in direct answer to Crow Dog. It had failed once already, and it was coming back in the winter session, and it was going to pass. And it did pass, in March of 1885. And after that, none of the rest of this would have been possible at all. But on that morning in September of 1884, riding down a coulee toward a camp of 40 lodges, Deputy Marshal Thomas Keene had in his coat a letter and no warrant, and beside him a Lakota horse breeder who had spent 7 months in a jail learning to read the shape of exactly that. "It's a letter," said Keene. "Yes," said Walks Behind. And neither man said anything else until they came over the last rise and saw the camp below them and stopped, both of them at the same moment, without a word. Because the whole of it was already assembled. 400 people in a great open horseshoe on the flat ground by the dry creek, standing in the early light. 44 horses held in a bunch on the west side by 6 young men. 2 families facing each other across an open space. Nobody moving. They had started at first light, exactly as Standing Elk had said, and Keene had lost an hour on the north road. "You did that," said Keene. "Yes," said Walks Behind. Keene sat his horse on the rise for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice with something odd in it, "How many of them are there?" "All of them," said Walks Behind. Part 6. The Woman Nobody Asked. It had begun 40 minutes earlier, and it had been going very badly. Not loudly. That is the thing people get wrong about that morning, and Sitomana corrected it for the rest of her life whenever anybody told it back to her. There was no shouting. 400 people stood in an open horseshoe on the flat by the dry creek in the cold, early light, and the loudest sound for the first half hour was a horse stamping. The form of it was old, and everybody knew it. Standing Elk spoke first, for the family that owed. He was 61, and he had done this once before, in 1869, for a cousin, and he had not slept. He did not make excuses. That was the first rule, and the hardest one. And Sitomana, standing among the women on the west side with her hands folded into her blanket, listened to her uncle not make a single one, and was prouder of him than she had ever been of anybody. "A man of your family is dead," he said. "He was killed by a young man of mine. There was whiskey in it, and there was a quarrel about water in it, and neither of those things carried the stone. My nephew carried it." He named the count. 44 horses, 4 over what had been asked, and the pipe bag, and a kettle, and 2 blankets. He named the obligation, in the full form, which takes some time to say properly, that the boy was given to that lodge, for wood, water, meat, and horses, that if he failed in it, his family carried the failure, that it continued until the widow of White Fox said it was finished, and that no other person living had the right to say it was finished. Then he stepped back. Elk Nation spoke for the other family, and he was scrupulous, and he was cold, and every person there understood that the coldness was correct and not personal. He acknowledged the count. He acknowledged that it was over the number asked. He said, without emphasis, that the family had made no complaint about the speed or the manner of the collection. And then, because it was the form, and because the form existed precisely to make the hardest part unavoidable, he said, "Let the young man speak." Hoxila walked out into the open ground. His sister watched him do it and could not breathe. He looked in that light, in front of 400 people, exactly 19 years old, and no more. He had been sick twice before dawn. He walked out to the middle and stopped and put his hands at his sides. And he said it in 11 words, the way she had made him practice it 40 times over 2 days. "I killed White Fox. It was my hand and my stone." He stopped. The silence went on for 4 or 5 seconds, which is a very long time in the open in front of 400 people. And Sitomana thought, now stop. Now stand still. And he did stand still. And then Bear Ribs stepped out of the line. What Bear Ribs said took perhaps 90 seconds, and it was, in Sitomana's judgment, the most effective piece of speaking she ever heard in her life, because it was entirely true. He did not scream. He walked out to within 6 feet of her brother and said, in a voice that reached the back of the crowd without ever being raised, "Say his age." Hoxila said nothing. "Say it. You have said 11 words that a woman wrote for you. Say his age." Hoxila did not answer, and Sitomana, with her fists closed inside her blanket, saw that he was doing it right, and that doing it right was going to look, to about 100 people there, like a boy who did not care. 31, said Bare Ribs. He was 31. He had a bad shoulder from a fall 4 years ago, and he could not throw with his right arm, and everyone here knows it. And you were 19, and you had a stone. He turned to the crowd. 44 horses, he said. Everybody has been talking about the 44 horses for 6 days. Great count, they say. Strong family. That woman has done a wonderful thing. His voice cracked once, and he let it. My brother has been dead for 9 days, and this camp has spent 9 days admiring the arithmetic. And then he said the sentence that nearly ended it. And where did those horses come from? Sitomana's blood stopped. 12 of them came in 5 days ago at dusk, said Bare Ribs. 12 head, in good flesh, all sound, from a family that had 9. I have looked at those horses. Everybody in this camp has looked at those horses, and everybody in this camp knows there is exactly one band on this creek they could have come out of. He turned back to Hochschiele. So which is it? Did your family pay for you, or did somebody buy you? There was a movement all through that crowd, and Sitomana stood in the line of women with her heart going like a hammer and understood, with absolute clarity, 3 things at once. That he was right. That if she spoke, a woman speaking out of turn in the middle of the form would hand him the whole morning. And that her uncle was going to have to lie in the open, in the form, and that Standing Elk had never lied in a public matter in his life, and that everyone there would hear it in his voice, and that it would be the end of him. Her uncle drew breath, and Washday Wing said, I have not spoken yet. She had been standing at the front of her family's line the whole time, in a gray blanket, with her mother-in-law on one side and her son holding the edge of her dress on the other, and she had not moved and had not made a sound, and Sitomana realized in that moment that she had not looked at her once. Nobody had. 400 people had spent 40 minutes discussing the price of her husband, and every single one of them had been watching the men. She was 27. She was 6 months carrying. She walked out into the open ground with the slow deliberateness of a woman that far along, and it took her a while, and nobody said one word while she did it. Sit down, brother, she said to Bare Ribs. He stood where he was. Sit down, she said, not loudly. You have been talking for 9 days. You have talked in front of the lodge, and on the path, and last night by the water. My husband's name has been in your mouth more than it has been in mine, and I have not said one word about it, because you are 24, and he was your brother, and you have nowhere to put it. She looked at him steadily. But you are not the one who has to live in the lodge, and you are not the one carrying his child, and this is not yours. Sit down. And Bare Ribs, after a moment that everybody there felt, went back and sat down. Washday Wing turned to the assembly. I will answer his question first, because it deserves an answer, she said. Where the horses came from is nothing to me. If they came from her uncle, or from a man in a coolie, or if she stole them out of the agency herd, they are the same horses. She let that stand for a second. What is asked of me is whether the count is accepted. Nobody asks a widow where the wealth was found. They did not ask my mother, and they did not ask my grandmother, and I am not going to be the first woman in this camp to be told she must inspect it. Something went through the crowd, not a sound exactly, a settling. Now, she said, the count. And Sitomana, 40 feet away, watched the woman look for a long moment at 44 horses standing bunched on the west side of the ground, and understood 1 second before she said it what she was going to say. I refuse it, said Washday Wing. The noise that came out of 400 people was not loud, and it was terrible. Elk Nation was on his feet. Standing Elk had gone the color of ash. Somebody in the women's line said "no" out loud. Bear Ribs sat perfectly still with his mouth slightly open, and Sitomana saw and remembered for 30 years that he looked frightened. "Be quiet," said Washtay Wing. "I have not finished. You have all been talking for 9 days, and you can be quiet for 2 minutes." The ground went silent. "I refuse the count as it is offered," she said, "and I will say exactly why, and then I will say what I will take, and then it is finished this morning, one way or the other." She turned so she was facing her own family as much as the other. 44 horses, she said. "I have 2 children, and 1 coming in December. What am I to do with 44 horses? I cannot graze them. I have no man to move them, and no man to break them, and no man to watch them, and by February 1/3 of them will be dead, and by spring the agent will have found some reason that the rest must be sold, and I will have a pile of paper dollars in a bag, and in 2 years there will be nothing at all, and my son will be 6 years old." She let that sit. That is what horses are to a lodge with no man in it. They are not wealth. They are work I cannot do. She turned to Standing Elk. "Keep them," she said. "Keep every one. They stay in your uncle's pen, and they stay in your family's name. And every year your family brings me what that band produces, the colts, the trade, whatever comes of it. And if there is a bad year, and there is nothing, then there is nothing, and I will not be told a story about it. And if you sell out of that band, 1 of every 3 is mine, and you will tell me before you do it, not after." Standing Elk stood there and said, "That is more than the count." "It is much more than the count," said Washtay Wing, "and it is much less, because I take the loss too. If they die, you have lost them, and I have lost them. That is the difference between being paid and being tied." Then she turned around and looked at Hochschild. "Now you," she said. And Sitomana watched her brother, standing alone in the middle of that ground, actually understand for the first time in 9 days what had happened to him. Not because a man had shouted at him, but because a pregnant woman in a gray blanket was looking at him. "They have arranged you like a horse," said Washtay Wing. "Wood, water, meat, given to the lodge. Every man here has been very satisfied with that arrangement for 9 days, and not one of them has asked me whether I want a 19-year-old boy standing at my door at first light every morning for 20 years. She let it be quiet for a moment. "I do not," she said. Someone in the crowd said something. She ignored it. "I will tell you what it is actually like," she said, "since nobody has thought to ask. My daughter is 4. She has asked me 11 times in 9 days where her father is. If you send this boy to my door before light every morning, then the first thing my son sees when he wakes up for the next 20 years is the man who killed his father, standing in the doorway with an armload of wood, and he will grow up on that. He will grow up looking at it, and when he is 15 and somebody says a word to him about it in the wrong tone, he will go and do the same thing this boy did, and then we will all be standing out here again in 20 years counting horses for my son." She looked around the whole horseshoe. "That is what your law does when it is done stupidly," she said, "and every one of you knows it, and it has happened in this camp before, and I am not going to have it happen in mine." Standing Elk said carefully, "Then what do you require?" And Washtay Wing said, "3 things, and I will not bargain about any of them." "Say them." "First, he does not come to my door, not before light, not after dark, not once. He works for that lodge, he cuts the wood, he brings the meat, he waters the horses, and he hands it to a 3rd person, and the 3rd person brings it to me. He will not be seen by my children." "Who is the 3rd person?" "His sister," said Washtay Wing. Sitomana felt every face on that ground turn toward her. "For 10 years," said the widow, "his sister brings it. She is the one who walked to 11 lodges in 3 days, so she is the one who can walk to mine. And she will sit down when she comes. She will not put it at the door and leave. She will come in and sit down and drink something and talk to me about nothing,
the way people do, because I am about to be a woman alone with 3 children in a camp that will remember me for one afternoon and then forget. And what I am actually afraid of is not hunger." Sitomana stood with her hands inside her blanket and found that she could not see very well. "Second," said Washtewing, "when my son is old enough, 12, 13, he is to be taught by that family. Horses. That boy is the best rider on this creek, and everybody here knows it, and it is the only thing he has ever been good at." She looked at Hakshila. "You will teach my son, not out of kindness, because it is owed, and you will do it in the open where everybody can see you doing it, so that when he is a grown man, nobody can ever say to him that his father's death was settled quietly." "And the third," said Standing Elk, and Washtewing said, "He says his name." She turned to Hakshila. "You said 11 words and a woman wrote them for you, and they were good words, and you did not say his name." Her voice did not rise. "Everybody here has said the dead man and the count and the young man for 9 days. My brother-in-law is right about that, and it is the only thing anybody has been right about. So you will say his name out loud here, and you will say it every time you speak of it for the rest of your life. And when you are an old man and your grandchildren ask you why you take meat to that lodge, you will say his name to them." Sitomana's brother stood in the open ground in front of 400 people. And then he said, in a voice that broke in the middle of it and that carried anyway, "White fox." And then, because nobody had told him to, and nobody had written it for him, "White fox, who could not throw with his right arm, and who pushed me twice instead of hitting me." There was a sound in that crowd. Washtewing looked at him for a long moment. "That is accepted," she said. And that is what Deputy Marshal Thomas Keene rode down into at 7:08 in the morning with 2 agency policemen behind him and a letter in his coat. 400 people standing in absolute silence in a horseshoe on the flat, and a pregnant woman in a gray blanket in the middle of it, and a boy standing in front of her with his hands at his sides, saying a dead man's name out loud. He stopped his horse at the edge of it. He was a professional, and he had been at this for 21 years, and what he did was the correct thing, which was nothing at all. He sat his horse at the outside of the crowd and waited, because a man who rides into the middle of 400 people to make an arrest is a man who will not be riding out. But it was not entirely professional, because he had come over that rise expecting a camp, dogs and smoke and women hauling water, and a boy to be pulled out of a lodge with 3 minutes of shouting and 1 woman hanging onto a wagon wheel, which is how it had gone the other 11 times. And what was in front of him was a court. He did not have the word for it at the time. He worked it out afterward, over a long while, and eventually said it out loud exactly once, in 1897, to a young deputy who did not understand what he was talking about. But he knew it standing there, the 2 parties facing each other, the space between them, the man speaking for each side, the assembly as witness, the accused standing alone in the open, the finding, the words that is accepted. He had sat in courtrooms for 21 years. He knew what he was looking at. And the whole way in, for an hour and a half, the man riding beside him had been saying the word law, and he had been correcting him each time, and saying the word custom. Part 7. The Giving. The crowd came apart when they saw him. Not in panic. It came apart the way a crowd does when everyone in it has decided independently and at the same instant to be somewhere slightly different, the outer ring thinning, the young men moving toward the horses, the women closing up around the children, 400 people rearranging themselves in about 8 seconds without one word being said. And then it stopped and held and turned around to look at him. Keene sat his horse and let them look. He had learned that in 21 years, and it had kept him alive at least twice. When you are one man in front of a great many, the single most dangerous thing you can do is move quickly, and the second most dangerous is to speak first. Standing Elk came out to him.
He came out alone, an old man in a good blanket, walking without hurry across 60 yards of open ground with 400 people watching, and he stopped at a proper distance from the horse's head and waited to be spoken to. "You're the head man here," said Keene.
The interpreter, one of the agency policemen, who had ridden up beside him, and who looked as though he would rather have been almost anywhere, put it into Lakota, and the answer came back. "He says he speaks for this family. He says the other family has its own man. He says if you have come for the boy, you should be told that the matter is finished." "Finished," said Keene. "Finished as of 6 minutes ago." Keene looked past him at the open ground, at the widow standing in the middle of it, at the boy. "I'll want to hear about that," he said, slowly, and all of it, and I'll be asking questions. "Is there some place we can sit down?" And Sitomana, standing in the line of women 40 feet away with her hands inside her blanket, watched the entire camp fail to understand what had just happened. They were braced for an arrest. They had been braced for it since Saturday night. And instead, a 52-year-old man in a dusty coat had asked whether there was some place to sit down, and her uncle had said yes, and 400 people were now standing in a field with nothing to do. She did not relax. She had grown up in the years she had grown up in, and she knew exactly what an official being reasonable in the morning was worth by the afternoon. It took 4 hours. They sat in the open, not in a lodge, Keene's choice, and walks behind told her afterward that it was a good sign, because a man who intends to do something ugly does it inside, where there are fewer witnesses. Elk Nation was there for the dead man's family, Standing Elk for the other. The policeman interpreted. Keene had a notebook, and he used it the entire time, and Sitomana, who had been called over within the first 10 minutes, and who sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap and her heart going hard, came to understand something about the man over the course of that morning that she never afterward forgot. He was not looking for a way to arrest her brother. He was looking for a way to write it down. That was all. That was the whole engine of him. He had a letter in his coat instructing him to take an offender into custody pending a determination of jurisdiction, and he had ridden 11 miles and found something he did not have a form for, and what he had done about it was to open a notebook. He asked questions for 4 hours, and they were not stupid questions. He asked who had set the number, and how, and whether there was a rate for horses against other goods, and what it was, and whether the rate was the same everywhere or differed by band. He asked whether the number could have been refused and what would have happened. He asked who was permitted to speak in the proceeding and who was not, and in what order, and why the widow had spoken after the men and not before. He asked twice, from 2 different directions, whether the boy had been compelled to appear or had appeared voluntarily. He asked how many times a thing like this had been done in this camp in the last 20 years, and Standing Elk thought about it and said 11, and named all 11, with the years and the names of the men who had judged them, and Keene wrote all of it down, and his hand was going fast by then. And then he asked the question that Sitomana had been waiting for since 7 in the morning. "Ask her," he said, nodding at Washday Wing, "whether she is satisfied. And tell her that I am asking it as an officer, and that if she says no to me, here, in front of these people, then I will act on it, and nobody in this camp can do anything about it afterward." And Sitomana thought, there it is. That is the whole thing. That is a man handing a 27-year-old widow the power to hang my brother, in public, at 11 o'clock in the morning. The interpreter put it into Lakota twice, because the first time he softened it, and Keene made him do it again. Washday Wing sat with her hands on her belly and did not answer for a long moment. Then she said, "Tell him I have 3 children and no husband, and the 3rd comes in December. Tell him I have taken what will feed them for 20 years. Tell him that if he takes that boy away in a wagon, I lose all of it, and I get nothing at all in its place, and my son grows up knowing that his father's death was worth nothing to anybody but a court." The policeman translated. "Tell him I am satisfied," she said. And tell him I want him to write down that I said it, and I want to see him write it." And Keene, who had spent 4 hours being professional and had not shown one thing on his face, said, "Tell her I'll do better than that," and turned the notebook around so that a woman who could not read one word of English could watch him form the letters and read the sentence out loud as he wrote it, and had the policeman translate it back to her, line by line, and then asked her whether it was correct. It took 11 minutes. Sitomana watched all 11 of them. At about 2 in the afternoon, Keene closed the notebook and stood up and said he wanted to speak to 2 people alone, the sister and the man who had met him at the ford. They walked out about 80 yards from the lodges, the 3 of them and the interpreter, and stood in the dry grass in the wind. "Here's where I am," said Keene, "and I'll say it plain, because you're both plain people and I'm tired." He took the letter out of his coat and held it up. "This is not a warrant. It's an instruction to take a man into custody pending determination of jurisdiction, which is a sentence written by a man in an office in a town 300 miles from here. And what it means in English is, pick him up and let somebody else sort out whether we're allowed to." He put it back in his pocket. 2 winters ago, the Supreme Court of the United States said we're not allowed to. Crow Dog. Your man there knows the name of it better than half the lawyers in this territory. "Then you cannot take him," said Sitomana through the interpreter. "I can take him," said Keene. "That's the part you want to understand. I can put him on a horse right now, and there's not a thing on this creek that would stop me. And he'd sit in a jail 4 months, and then in February or March, some judge would look at Crow Dog and let him go. And by then this—" He moved his hand at the camp, the horses, the ground where the horseshoe had been. "This would be over. The horses would be scattered. That woman would have nothing. Your family would have spent everything twice. And he'd come home in the spring having done nothing, owing nothing, and every man in this camp would know that the old way had failed and the wagon had won." He looked at her. "That's what I can do. Legally. Today. And nobody would ever ask me one question about it." Sitomana stood in the wind and said nothing. "I'm not going to," said Keene. He rubbed his face. "And I'll tell you why. And it's not because your man out-argued me on the road, though he came closer than anybody's come in a long while." He looked out at the creek. "It's because I've been doing this 21 years, and I've taken 11 men off this reservation, and I know what happened to 9 of them. And not one of those 9 put a stick of wood in front of a widow's door. Not one. I've been telling myself that whole time that I'm carrying the law into people who haven't got one." He stopped. "And I rode over that hill this morning, and there were 400 people standing in a horseshoe running a trial, with an accused man in the middle of it who could have walked north into the hills any night for 9 days and stood there instead." He looked at Sitomana. "Why didn't he run?" he said. 9 days. Nobody guarding him. Why didn't he run? And Sitomana said, "Because if he ran, it would be paid by me, and by my uncle, and by my sister's children. That is what the law is. It is not the rope. It is that everybody you have ever loved is standing behind you, holding the other end of it." Keene was quiet for a moment. "That's the thing we haven't got," he said. "Christ, that's the whole thing we haven't got." Then he was a professional again, and it was worse, because what he said next was the truth. "Now here's what I'm going to do, and then here's what's coming, and you'll want to hear the second part more than the first." He counted it off on his fingers. 1. I'm going to write a report. It will say that I proceeded to the camp, that I found the matter had been disposed of by the tribal authority prior to my arrival, that the widow and the family of the deceased declined to make complaint, and that in view of the decision in ex parte Crow Dog, one did not consider that a federal court had jurisdiction over the offense. That's 4 sentences, and every one of them is true, and there's not a man in the department who can touch me for it. 2. That report goes in a file, and the file goes in a cabinet, and in about 6 weeks a clerk will read it and be annoyed and put it down, because there are 400 files in that cabinet, and this one has no white man in it. He put his hand down. 3. And this is the one. There is a bill in Congress right now, It failed in the spring, and it's coming back in the winter session, and it is going to pass, and everybody in the service knows it's going to pass. And it was written for exactly one reason, which is Crow Dog. He said it flatly. 7 crimes: murder, manslaughter, rape, arson, burglary, larceny, assault with intent to kill. Committed by one Indian against another, on a reservation, tried in a federal court. When that passes, and it'll be spring, I'd guess, everything I have just declined to do becomes something I am required to do, and there'll be no argument in it anywhere, from anybody, ever again. The wind went through the dry grass. "How long?" said Walks Behind. 6 months, maybe 8. "So this is the last one," said Walks Behind. "On this creek?" said Keen. "For a killing? Yes. I'd say this is the last one." And the 3 of them stood in the dry grass 80 yards from the camp, and nobody said anything for a while. "Then write it down," said Sitomana. Keen looked at her. "Write all of it down," she said. "Everything you asked this morning. The number, and the rate, and who speaks, and in what order, and the 11 times before, and the 11 names, and what she said, and what my brother said, and that 400 people stood in a field to watch it, and that when it was over, nobody had to be dragged anywhere." Her voice did not rise. "You have been writing for 4 hours. Nobody in the history of this camp has ever written any of it down. And if what you say is true, then in a year there will be no more of it, and in 40 years there will be nobody alive who did it. And the only sentence that will exist about my people and this thing will be a sentence written by somebody who never saw it." She looked at the notebook in his hand. "So make it that sentence," she said. Keen stood there for a long moment. "That's not what a deputy's report is for," he said. "No. It'd go in the same cabinet." "Yes," said Sitomana, "and a cabinet is longer than a person." He rode out at 4 o'clock. Before he went, he did 2 more things, and both of them mattered more than anybody there understood at the time. The first was that he called for the boy. Hochschild came out and stood in front of the horse, and Keen looked down at him for a while. "Tell him this exactly," he said to the interpreter. "Tell him I have let it go today for reasons that have nothing to do with him and that he did not earn. Tell him that inside of a year the law will change, and that if he ever does anything like this again, there will be no horses and no council and no widow's decision. There will be a wagon and a jail and a rope, and it will not matter one bit what his family says." The interpreter said it. "And tell him," said Keen, "that I have taken 11 men off this reservation in 21 years, and every one of them was 19 or 22 or 24, and every one of them had drink in him, and every one of them thought the thing was over the moment it stopped. Tell him he is the only one of the 12 who is going to sleep in his own country tonight." Hochschild stood there with his hands at his sides. "Tell him," said Keen. And then he stopped and said something that was not for the notebook and that the interpreter had to think about before he translated it. "Tell him, don't waste it. There's men in a hole in the ground in that penitentiary right now who'd have given anything for what he got handed this morning, and most of them were no worse than he is." The second thing was to the woman. He walked his horse over to where Washday Wing was standing with her mother-in-law and took his hat off, which nobody in that camp had ever seen a government man do. "Tell her I'm sorry for her trouble," he said. "And tell her that in 21 years she is the only person I've ever met in a case like this who got asked what she wanted, and that she had to ask for it herself, and that this says something about my profession that I'll be thinking about on the ride home." Then he put his hat back on and rode east with 2 agency policemen behind him. And Sitomana stood at the edge of the camp with 200 other people and watched him go until he was a small, dark thing on the flat, and then a smaller one, and then nothing. And her uncle, standing beside her, said the thing that everybody there was thinking, and that only an old man could say out loud. "We were lucky in the man." "Yes," said Sitomana. "It should not be luck." "No," she said. "It should not."
Part 8. First Snow. The first snow came on the 11th of October, which was late, and it came the way it does in that country. No wind, no warning. A gray afternoon that went quiet and then began to fill up. Sitomana was married 4 days after the giving. There was no feast because there was nothing to feast with. Her uncle had 8 horses in another family's name and $11 worth of goods gone out of his lodge, and every household that had given, and a wedding in that autumn would have been an obscene thing. So it was done the way poor people do it, which is by everybody agreeing that it has been done. Walks Behind came to Standing Elk's lodge in the middle of the morning with 4 horses, the correct gesture made publicly, in daylight, where 9 lodges could see it, and Standing Elk came out and accepted them. And then, in front of the whole north end of that camp, the old man took the younger one by the arm and brought him inside and sat him down at his fire and fed him. That was the entire ceremony. That was the whole of it. And Sitomana, watching from the side, understood that her uncle had thought about it carefully and had chosen the one act that could not be undone or explained away. A man of standing, 61 years old, taking a shunned man's arm in front of witnesses and putting food in his hand. It took about 9 seconds. It ended 3 years. Not completely. Nothing ends completely. There were 4 households on that creek that never sat easily with Walks Behind as long as he lived, and there was a woman who crossed to the other side of the path for 11 years, and there was always a half-second of adjustment when he came into a group of men who had not expected him. But children began to come to his coulee. That was the thing that told her it had worked. By December, there were boys hanging on his corral rails, watching him work a horse, 4 and 5 at a time, in the cold, for hours, and he would let them sit there for an entire afternoon without saying 6 words to them, and they came back the next day. He had, it turned out, an enormous amount of patience and absolutely no idea what to do with a compliment. She kept her own lodge for the first year, as agreed. He never mentioned it, not once, in all 4 seasons, not by hint, not by joke, not by leaving a thing of hers at his fire to see whether she would come back for it. She worked at his coulee in the day, and slept in her own lodge at the camp, and rode out again in the morning, and the whole camp watched this arrangement with enormous interest for about 6 weeks, and then got bored of it. What happened in that year was not romance, and Sitomana would have laughed at anybody who called it that. What happened was this. They discovered that they worked well together. That was all. And it turned out to be a very great deal. He was the better hand with horses by a distance, and she was better than he was with people. And within 2 months they had fallen into a division of the world that neither of them had negotiated. He bred and broke and moved and doctored. She sold. She knew which traders shorted the weight and which agency clerk could be got at with civility. And she knew, because she had spent 3 days learning it the hard way in September, exactly what every household on that creek could pay and would rather die than admit it could not pay. In the spring of 1885 they sold 11 head and made more money than either of them had ever handled at one time. And in the summer of that year, Sitomana did a thing that she thought about for a long time first. She took 2 horses to Iron Shell. He came out and looked at them and looked at her. "I refused you," he said. "You did. And now you bring me 2. You told me the truth at your door in 9 words when you could have wasted my morning," said Sitomana. "There were 40 households in this camp that September, and 11 of them gave me horses, and 2 of them told me the truth. Take them. You will have 5, and you will be able to haul wood in January, and in 3 years I will come and ask you for something." Iron Shell took the horses. He was, 30 years later, a man of some standing in that district, and he stood up in a meeting in 1911 and spoke for her son against an agent, and everybody thought it was because of the leases. At the end of the first year, Sitomana took down her own lodge and did not put it up again, and nothing was said about it by either of them at the time or afterward. They had 2 children, a daughter in 1886 and a son in 1889. The daughter had her father's flat, unhurried way of looking at a thing before touching it, which as a small child was funny, and by the time she was 15 was not funny at all. And she outlived everyone in this story and died in 1961 in a house with electric light, having been interviewed twice by a man from a university who got most of it wrong. And the boy. Here is what happened to Hochschiele, and it is not a redemption, and Sitomana never once in her life described it as one. He cut wood. That is the whole of the first 4 years. He cut wood and hauled it and killed what game there was to kill in a country where the game was going, and he brought all of it to his sister's door, and his sister carried it 400 paces to a lodge he was not permitted to approach. He did it in the winter of 1884, which was hard. He did it in 1885 and 1886. He did it drunk twice in the second year, and Sitomana found out about it both times, and what she did the second time was to say nothing at all to him for 9 days, which he told his own children about 40 years later and said was the worst punishment he ever received from anybody. He did not become a good man quickly or dramatically or in one clean piece. What happened was much smaller and much stranger, and it was this. At some point in the third year, without noticing it, he stopped doing it because it was required and started doing it because it was the thing he did. It became a job. It became the shape of his week. He got up before light because that is when he got up. And in 1897, when Washday Wing's son turned 13, Hochschiele, who was by then 32, married, with 3 children of his own, and known on that whole stretch of the creek as the best hand with a green horse between the agency and the river, began to teach him, in the open, in front of everybody, exactly as she had required. It took 4 years. The boy was good. He was better than good. He had the hands for it, and by 17 he could do things with a horse that men rode 11 miles to watch. And Sitomana, who watched a great deal of it from the rail of her husband's corral, said that the strangest thing she ever saw in her life was those two, in the summer of 1900, sitting on the top rail eating out of the same bowl, arguing about a bay gelding, comfortable as brothers, the man who had killed his father, and the boy, and neither of them, so far as she could ever tell, pretending anything at all. She never decided whether that was a beautiful thing or a terrible one. She leaned, in the end, toward beautiful, and admitted freely that she might only be saying so because he was her brother. He said White Fox's name for the rest of his life. He said it at the beginning of every account he ever gave of it, to anybody, including his grandchildren, including a man from a newspaper in 1922 whom he threw off his place after 11 minutes. He never once said, "the man I killed." He said, "White Fox, who could not throw with his right arm." Washday Wing had her third child in December of 1884, in the cold, and it lived, and it was a girl. Sitomana came to that lodge with meat and wood and whatever the horses had made for 10 years as required. She sat down every time. She drank something and talked about nothing as required. And for the first 2 years, that is exactly what it was, an obligation, discharged by a woman who was tired, to a woman who did not particularly want her there. They did not become friends because of the horses. They became friends in the third winter over a sick child. Washday Wing's second, 4 days of it, and Sitomana simply did not go home. And after that, it was a different thing entirely, and it lasted 41 years. And when Sitomana died in 1925, the last person to sit with her was a woman of 68 who had refused her husband's blood price in front of 400 people. Bear Ribs left in the spring of 1885. He went north with 3 other young men and worked for a cattle outfit, and came back in 1889 with money and a horse and a way of not talking about the years between. And he was a quiet man after that, and a good uncle to his brother's children. He and Hochschiele never spoke again, not once, in 40 years on the same creek. That is also part of it. Not everything closes. Standing Elk died in the winter of 1891, in his lodge, in his sleep, at 68, having spent the last 7 years of his life as a man with no horses and a very large amount of standing. And the law came, exactly when Keynes said it would. The Major Crimes Act passed in March of 1885, 6 months after the morning on the flat, attached to an Indian appropriations bill so that it would not have to be argued about on its own. 7 crimes, murder among them, committed by one Indian against another in Indian country, tried in the courts of the United States. It was challenged the next year, and the Supreme Court upheld it, and that was the end of the argument, and it has been the law ever since in one form or another. After March of 1885, nothing in this story could have happened. There is no version of the 11 days after that spring. There is no walking to 11 lodges. There is no widow standing up in the middle of 400 people and saying, "I refuse it," and then saying what she will take instead. There is a wagon and a jail 4 months, and 12 men in a room 140 miles away who have never seen the creek, and a woman in a lodge with 3 children who is not a party to the proceeding, who will not be asked what she requires, who will not be informed of the outcome, and who will get nothing. That is not an opinion about which system was better. Both of them had blood in them, and both of them failed people. And Sitomana, who lived under one and then the other, and was in a position to compare, said only one thing about it that anybody wrote down. A granddaughter asked her, in about 1920, why the old way had stopped, and Sitomana said, "It did not stop. It was stopped. Those are different, and you will want to know the difference when you are older." The first snow came on the 11th of October, 1884. Sitomana was at the coulee. She had been out since before light, and she had spent the morning with her husband moving 22 head down out of the north end to the winter ground, and it had taken longer than it should have because one of the mares was in a mood, and because the boys from the camp had shown up and had been more help than hindrance, which was new. She came up out of the draw in the middle of the afternoon, and the sky had gone the color of a wet stone. And she stopped and stood and looked at it. 11 days, they had said, until the first snow. And it had been 39 days, because it was a late year, and everything that could possibly have happened in those 39 days had happened, and she was standing here on the 11th of October alive, married, with her brother's debt on a schedule, and her uncle's name intact, and a woman 400 paces from her lodge who would have food in February. The first flakes came down through the still air. Walks behind came up beside her with a coil of rope over his shoulder and looked at the sky and then at her, and said nothing, because he had worked out by then that she did not like to be spoken to in the first minute of a snow. They stood there together and watched it come down on the grass. Down in the camp, 400 paces from Sitomana's old lodge, a boy of 19 was stacking cut wood against the side of his sister's place, where she would find it in the morning and carry it, as required, to a door he was not permitted to approach. He had been at it since noon. He had another hour of it. It was going to be a long winter, and everybody knew it. And there was a great deal of wood still to cut. And in the spring, the law was going to change, and none of them knew that yet, except 3 people, who had stood in a field of dry grass on a windy afternoon in September and been told. The snow came down on the camp and on the dry creek and on 44 horses in a pen that belonged to 2 families at once. And Sitomana stood on the rim of the coulee and thought, without any particular feeling about it, the way you think about weather. It is here. We are all still here. That is what it was for.